So today we're going to be talking about RIA best practices for complying with the new cyber rule. It's not finalized yet, and so we're talking about the proposed rule that's up on the docket. But we have a number of industry experts with us today, Michelle Jacko, Jason Ewasko, and Christian Kelly, and they'll be sharing their insights and best practices on how to prepare for what's in the proposed new rule. Michelle, why don't you start us off by introducing yourself?
Certainly. Next slide, please. My name is Michelle Jacko. I am the managing partner of Jacko Law Group. I'm also the CEO of Core Compliance. And, you know, it's really interesting. I've been doing this for 27.5 years now. And a lot of what we're seeing in the cybersecurity space is it's not only fresh and new, but there is a re-existing pattern from the regulators that you can see, other than focusing on the advisor's fiduciary duty of the duty of loyalty, duty of care, which is all about, you know, making sure that we're acting in the best interest of clients, making sure we're making adequacy of disclosures. We also now are seeing this come full throttle in that cybersecurity space, as there's new expectations around risk assessments and everything we're doing. So, you know, I'm really excited to join you this morning and really focusing on, you know, what this practice area means for investment advisors, broker-dealers, advisors of private funds, and investment companies in general, as we navigate through some of the risk mitigation steps that you can take as firms. Jason, I believe you're next.
Yep, if you could go to the next slide, please. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Jason Ewasko, I'm the Chief Development Officer with Core Compliance. Been in the legal and or compliance and financial services for a quarter century, which is horrifying, and have been in the consulting side of things for about a decade now. Worked closely with some firms in the cybersecurity space in past iterations of my career, so this is nothing new. It's been around for a while. Very much looking forward to getting this information out today. I think it'll be valuable. You're going to hear a lot of good stuff. And hopefully a lot of it is a motivator to get proactive when it comes to your cybersecurity program. So looking forward to a good presentation. Christian.
Yep. Yes, good to be here with everybody. My name is Christian Kelly. I'm the CTO at Xantrion. We are a managed security provider, and again, have been in the industry for a long time. And, you know, we work with a lot of RIAs and financial clients in the technology space, and so have been working, you know, for a decade or more with regulated clients, you know, going through SEC exams as it relates to technology and helping our clients get technology programs that are secure and meaningful and have good outcomes.
Next slide, please. All right, so today we're going to be covering the overview of current regulatory requirements and the proposed NCR, NCR's operational impacts on the business, NCR's impact on compliance personnel, top NCR considerations to share with senior management today. After all, today is mostly about helping you prepare in time, and then our observations on a good cyber environment, and then we'll wrap it up with compliance best practices for your cyber program.
All right. So I think I'll kick it off with an overview of the current regulatory requirements for, you know, just the cybersecurity space in general. And I always like to start off with, where is the staff focusing on their efforts during the examination program this year, real time, before we really dive into the proposed rule, because it's always important to know, what do we need to do today? What is the focus? And, you know, if you look back, cybersecurity has been a hot topic and listed in the SEC's exam priorities list now since 2016. So it's been a long journey. We really started seeing cybersecurity come to the forefront in 2015. So it's been a long journey for all of us. And I think that this year, what we've seen is a change in the focus, where not only is the staff focused on information security and operational resiliency, but a lot of that is being, you know, I would say generated, that energy is being generated by the increase in the number of ransomware attacks that we saw over the last 12 months. So if you think about it in more general terms, what the staff is looking at is everything from the geopolitical and market events that led to cybersecurity attacks. What's the root cause of this? And how is that going to impact the way that we should be responding in our cybersecurity programs? So what the staff did was in their exam priorities, they mentioned that there's 3 critical areas that they're going to be focusing on, which is number 1, the protection of investor information. Number 2, the protection of your books and records. And 3, the protection of client assets. So consequently, when the exams team comes in, they're going to really be focusing on your internal controls and specifically your policies and procedures, your governance documents, and your incident response plan. And while I know that has been around for a while now, since we've seen, if you look at the NIST framework and what we should be thinking about as a firm, it's really going a step further, where the staff is going to be taking a look at what are your internal controls in Regulation SP, for example, or Regulation SID, which is dealing with identity theft. And we saw that the staff issued a risk alert on Reg SID last year. I always think that's a great place to start, is to take that risk alert, look at those various areas that the SEC has focused on and saying, this is what we saw as good requirement or good best practices, if you will. And these are the areas that we saw deficiencies at, and actually use that as you're testing in your annual review program this year. I can go through and say, did we think about this? Have we addressed this in our internal control documents and what have you? And then the other thing that they're also focusing on is really, what is your internal control metrics that you're using for books and records? Because if you look at how we're protecting investor information, that's going to be all the different cybersecurity controls that you have, especially if you're using in a paperless society that we're living in right now. How are we protecting that with firewall, multi-factor authentication, all those various controls, but also what steps are we taking if we're using vendors, for example, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to protect that information on the cloud? And what are our efforts revolving, due diligence and the like? They also want you, though, as an advisor, and we'll see this in the proposed rule, to make sure that you have some kind of a system for reporting. If there is a cyber event, and that really goes into your incident response plan, how are you going to communicate with your investors? And also, how are you going to communicate now with the proposed rule to regulators? So that's a great way to go, a segue to go into the next slide. Continuing focusing on the examination efforts for 2023, the staff also talked about the need to review the security and integrity of your third-party vendors and their products and services. So I'm going to give you an example. I want you to think about all the different areas where you may be sharing your confidential client information. Who might you share that with? And so, for example, as a law firm, Jacko Law Group often receives our confidential client information. Let's say if we're conducting a mock SEC exam, we need to look at trade blotters and the like, client files. Have you ever asked your law firm to provide you with what their cybersecurity program is? And what you need to think about is that some of your vendors are not registrants, so they are not subject to the same cybersecurity controls that you have as an RIA. And so it's really taking a look at, I think, and almost doing an inventory of who might obtain our confidential client information. How do we protect that valuable asset that we have? And are we then taking the steps to go out and conduct due diligence to see what are those cybersecurity controls? And I can only speak for our firm in the fact that not only, do we have a cybersecurity program written in place, but we actually have a DDQ response we provide to clients that if they ask for a cyber controls, it's already, drawn up, it's ready to be shared. And I think that that's something that you should also evaluate as part of your due diligence. What is the quickness for that vendor to respond to you if you're asking for that information? So then finally, the other point that the staff made was, what is the resiliency of the firm to address climate-related risks? And that's really about your business continuity plan, what you would be doing if there was some climate-related event. So I think that we have a lot of those controls already in place, but what they're finding is that the business continuity plan is not being tested. Or if you say that you're doing adequate training, you're not doing that ongoing training. So really take a look at your plan and make sure that what you say you're going to do, you're actually doing in 2023. Next slide, please. So now in preparing, you know, we've gotten through how do I prepare for that SEC exam? How am I evaluating my current controls? Let's take a look at the proposed program. And importantly, it is anticipated that this proposed rule will come out in 2023. You know, there's been lots of banner, lots of comment letters received, you know, but I think that, you know, that's really bringing the importance of the priority of cybersecurity is to the forefront. And what this proposed rule has provided is a framework of how firms should be thinking about how we address those cybersecurity risks. And what I've done here is I'm trying to provide you a very abbreviated punch list of these are the big highlights of the rule. So the first one is how are we going to you know, be responding to and recovering from a cyber event? And I'm going to tell you internally and what I've seen for my clients that have had cyber events, most folks are ready to respond. They immediately try to, you know, pinpoint what is the root cause of the cyber event. They try to stop that. Then they go through the various steps of trying to, you know, remediate that and then obviously recover from that cyber event. What I'm not seeing necessarily, though, real time, or at least in close proximity to real time, is the documentation of how they're denoting what we're doing, when we're doing, and that there's a clear logical step process that's being taken place. Because in an exam, or even in the case of reporting to the SEC, that's what the staff is really going to be focusing on. Have we done those necessary steps? So it's not that it's not occurring, it's that it's not being necessarily documented. So something to think about. The other thing that's caused a lot of angst is this mandatory 48-hour incident reporting requirement. Now, if you have a cyber event, you're going to need to disclose this on Form ADV Part C. So we'll be seeing, you know, that released in the coming days ahead once the rule becomes final. But I think that the biggest thing for you to think about is, gosh, in 48 hours, am I really going to be able to pinpoint what caused that cyber event? In some cases, yes. In many cases, you know, it might not be you're still in that investigatory stage. But the purpose behind that is to see, is there a systemic cyber event occurring across the globe that regulators, law enforcement, the FBI need to be aware of so that they can take steps to get the word out to prevent a cyber attack occurring on a global basis. Next slide, please. As we continue working through that framework, some of the other things to think about is that now you will have to conduct an annual cyber risk assessment. And, you know, I know Jason's going to be talking about this in a little bit, but when you think about it, the question is, how do I do that? I might not be that cyber expert from the CCO seat. So, you know, am I going to need to rely upon vendors? I think that would be a very prudent thing to do, to get someone in there that has that skill and wherewithal. And then your role as the CCO would be to oversee how that risk assessment is being conducted, what's being documented, and the like. We also need to think about how will we be disclosing the cyber risk and incident to investors. So think about what would that communication look like? And what I'm starting to see is in certain incident response plans, our clients are actually drafting what I would say at least a foundational document to get ahead of that from a reputational management standpoint to think about how might we be communicating that. Next, we have the record keeping requirement. So, you know, really think about if I'm going to have to do this cyber risk assessment, how's that going to be captured? And then a lot of times what I see is that while an IT firm might be able to perform that risk assessment, my question is, how is it documented? And oftentimes those books and records might be kept by the vendor and not given to the firm. So I know in some firms you might get an IT health report card, for example, from your vendor. I expect the CCO to see that. I expect you to have those regular dialogues with either your internal or external IT, provider. The question really becomes, how are we capturing that from our own books and records requirements? And if they see a gap, okay, it's not just that the IT vendor addresses it, It's that I actually have that feedback and that documentation so that I can both denote it that that was an issue, and as well as evidence that we took steps to proactively address that risk. And then finally, thinking about monitoring and limiting the user and access vendor management. User access limitations have long been a control that's been around in the NIST framework for a long, long time, and been talked about at various SEC events when the staff is having dialogue about cybersecurity and controls. But the question is, are you going back? It's not just a one-time thing when an employee is hired. Think about this on an ongoing basis. And what are your control mechanisms? Vendor management we'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. What I want you to think about is also for reporting purposes. If we're now going to have to go to the SEC and we're going to have to report about this incident, this is the type of report that you should start preparing. And my thought is, from a compliance program standpoint, we're very big on forums or having what I would call a dashboard. And it would be interesting for you to potentially think about developing a dashboard that would have these various components in this, such as when was that incident discovered? Is this an ongoing threat or was it a limited one-time event? What really was this incident? And as a result of this incident, was data stolen, altered, accessed, or used for any unauthorized purposes? I could just see check the boxes with an other field where you could explain and expand upon that. And then thinking about it to the next step, and this is what I often see that is not part of an IRP or a report, which is based on this incident, what was the impact? And I'm going to say both an impact to your clients as well as your day-to-day operations. Did it change the way that you're conducting business? Did it impact your compliance program? Did that then trigger new policies and procedures or internal controls at your firm? And then finally, if we think about the remediation efforts of the incident, that's really going full circle. You're addressing and eradicating the problem, and then what you're doing is taking that next step and really proactively monitoring that and making sure that this risk doesn't happen again, and that those internal controls that you did implement are actually effective. So, my big risk management, takeaway in all of this is super hard for you to be doing on your own. I do believe that it's really imperative to, partner with a vendor such as Xantrion to do these cyber risk assessments, because there's so many different things. And I think from a compliance standpoint, we're looking at, what I would call standard operating procedures, but we're not always able to conduct that granular testing as it relates to cybersecurity. And that's a challenge for anyone. Next slide, please. The other thing that I would like you to think about from a risk management standpoint is when you're looking at your cybersecurity program, think about when, we all have cybersecurity policies and procedures, but are they really robust enough to manage cyber risks? And what I've often seen is we have the compliance manual version, which is a summary of the cybersecurity program, and then there's a standalone document. And if you haven't had your IT folks review the cybersecurity program documentation, I think this is a great time for you to do that. Really take a look at not only what's anticipated to be required for the cybersecurity program, but really going through the books and records, how they've captured these risks, who's doing what report. And a lot of times I might hear commentary such as, well, we're not paid as an IT vendor to do a written report. Or I'll talk to an internal IT department and they'll say, we don't know what to write. We don't know what to include. So this really comes about dialogue and communication, as well as just setting expectations about delineating who is doing what when doing that cyber risk assessment. And finally, one of the requirements in the proposed release is to have and identify a competent, Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, if you will. And that person is supposed to be reporting to the board of directors, or at least your executive management team. I want to stress the word competent. Make sure that whoever you appoint truly does have a background, not only in the proposed rule, but really is on top of cybersecurity, the risks, and what the steps that the firm should be taking to address some of these areas, and at least has some type of a technological background. And with that, Christian, I'll give you the baton, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you. So as we look at the operational impacts or things that you're actually going to have to likely do as it relates to controls or the technology side, as Michelle spoke about, it's almost everyone's going to have to update their incident response plans, because if the 48-hour requirement comes in, that inherently will change. That'll force your hand in doing it. Regardless of how it all plays out, looking at your incident response plan and making sure it aligns with the new proposed rules is something that everybody's going to need to do. It's likely going to need to change how you report, how quickly you report. We know those things are going to change. Other workflows will likely also be altered by the rules. So, set aside some time to handle that when these comes out. The other thing is vendor due diligence programs. Most people have vendor due diligence programs and processes in place. It's likely that that's going to need to be stepped up with these new requirements. So, making sure you have documented all of the vendor due diligence processes that you've done, that they make their way into your annual and quarterly reporting. If you haven't done vendor due diligence around key vendors, like Michelle said, that have access to client data. So again, it was a great point. Does your partner, your law firm, right, that may have data, have you done a check on them? Have you asked them what their cyber controls are? And have you actually documented that? And has that made its way back into your program? So again, finding out those key partners, SaaS vendors are another big play out there. There's SaaS vendors that are very easy to understand, are going to have everything in place. Microsoft, big vendors like that, Box. You can assume that you can go to their trust centers and pull down the documentation and file that away. But more niche vendors, startups, there's a lot of niche vendors that aren't, might not have the security programs in place that you might think they do. So really digging in and understanding what they have in place. And if a vendor is like, oh, our app is in AWS, so therefore it's secure, Amazon's securing it, that's not an answer. That's a bad answer. You need to understand what the company's controls are, what their personnel's controls are, and how they access your data and your client's data. So having a good program around that is going to be important. Vulnerability management is something that's called out specifically. There isn't a lot of prescriptive called out controls, but vulnerability management and remediation is an important one. So making sure that you have a program in place that calls out the vulnerabilities and that you actually have a path towards remediation. It's very easy to get a list of vulnerabilities out there, but showing over time that those vulnerabilities are being driven down meaningfully, right? So you're taking care of the most important ones. You can't get to zero. No one's expecting you to get to zero vulnerabilities, but have a path towards remediation and be able to show that in your documentation in your annual and quarterly reviews. Okay, so this is the next slide. Make sure you're reviewing your cybersecurity program and understand what you have in place today, and plan for changes, right? There aren't huge amounts of changes coming as it relates to technical controls. They're shoring it up, and most of the guidance is around documentation and governance. But make sure that you do have the programs in place and that they're documented. Review those on an annual basis at minimum. Quarterly is probably better, but definitely have a scheduled annual review that's documented, that you come together with your teams and fully flesh that out along with your risk assessments. And identify service providers, like we've said, who handle that information, and make sure you're doing that due diligence. Next slide, please. So one final thought here is, as you look at your security programs and controls as they're laid out, you're going to want to look in your policies and understand for each program element, is it something that you're doing internally, or is it something that you're outsourcing, right? Like Michelle said, not everybody can do all of these technical controls and all of these compliance activities internally. So, make sure it's defined, right? That's the step A. Make sure it's defined and it's in your program. And then make sure that you understand who's performing that, right? Is it someone internal or is it external? And the key here is, if it is someone external, if you've outsourced it, that's not the end of your responsibility. You can't just say, vulnerability management as an example. Oh, we've outsourced that, therefore, my responsibility ends in just saying to the SEC if there's an audit, oh, I've outsourced it. No, you've got to have oversight and make sure that the reports and the outcomes of whatever vendor is supporting you comes back into your program and that you have that documented. So for each control, again, make sure it's documented, make sure you understand, what it is, some performance description, if it's internal, if it's external, who it is, and then make sure that there's oversight and that's feeding back into your kind of programs.
Yeah, Christian, can I actually pause in there? Because this is a great point that you brought up, and it's just because it's just happened in an exam. The staff was so focused on just that point that you made, where it was, we want to understand what steps you're taking to oversee that vendor, because ultimately they're acting as your agent. And I think a lot of folks aren't thinking about that when we actually are going out there and we're engaging someone to do a certain role responsibility. They are truly embedded in the firm. They're representing the firm's efforts. And so it is still owned by the firm. So that gives you lots of different reasons to focus. And the staff was very concerned that there weren't enough efforts being made for oversight. To your point, a once a year look under the hood is not frequent enough. It's that ongoing communication and dialogue. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Absolutely. I think the next slide is Jason's.
Great, thanks, Christian. Appreciate that. So just a couple of minutes, I wanted to talk about some impacts on compliance people with the new rule coming down the pike. Starting with probably the most obvious thing, policies and procedures. And Michelle touched on it a little bit already. As with any policies and procedures, the ones you already have, they need to be tailored not only to your firm's specific business model, but also to your existing cybersecurity environment and any unique cybersecurity risks that your firm may face. Michelle alluded to having a standalone cybersecurity policy and procedure document. You'll want to cross-reference that at least in your compliance manual. So when a regulator comes in to take a look around, everything is lining up together and you've got a comprehensive framework in place. We think it's a good idea to enlist the assistance of a third-party cyber specialist to help work through some of the really in-the-weeds technical angles of your cybersecurity policies. In speaking with Christian as we prepared for today's event, Xantrion, good example. They can assist with security plans and technical controls as part of what they refer to as a security policy document. So there are plenty of options out there, but you want to be out there now looking into getting your cyber policy squared away so that when the SEC does come in, you've got it tightened up nicely. Again, referencing the cybersecurity assessments, this is going to be conceptually similar to 20647 annual reviews, right? It's going to be something you've got to check that box every year. Having a strong compliance program obviously is helpful, but you're going to need, we think, a specialist to come in and handle at least the technical angles of that assessment. Your internal cybersecurity folks, your internal compliance folks probably aren't equipped to deal with some of the higher end tech angles that you need to address. And so having a third party handling that for you will be very helpful. And then, the compliance people need to then work with management and your IT team to mitigate whatever findings might come out of those assessments. Again, having a third party in there is going to be very helpful, we think. Then the next slide, please. Another area where we think there's going to be some impact is the notice of the incidents that Michelle described earlier. Every firm is going to be a little bit different in terms of how their compliance people are involved. But at a minimum, I would expect that some member of the compliance team is going to have to be involved with drafting the language that's going to be the Form ADVC disclosure that's going to be submitted to the SEC. And certainly handling the filing itself will likely be a compliance duty. So I see it essentially as a cyber-specific breed of an other than annual amendment that your compliance team will be responsible for. So, hopefully that's infrequent, but be prepared. And then last, the additional disclosures here. This refers to follow-ups on an initial ADVC submission to provide additional information going forward. This is a whole new thing, so we don't know exactly what it's going to look like going forward. So we'll figure it out. A firm like ours will help our clients figure that out as we move forward once the new rule is in place. But I'd expect that these types of amendments will be about the resolution of incidents after investigation, additional explanations as to the scope of an incident, and importantly, whether there ultimately were direct impacts on clients and client assets as a result of the incident. So that is certainly something that your compliance staff should be prepared for once the rule is in place. If we could go to the next slide, please. We've got some tips we wanted to talk about. So you've heard me say this 4 times in 2 minutes. I think firms would really be well served by engaging with third-party cybersecurity specialist firms to assist with a number of different aspects of living with the new cyber rule. At a minimum, that would include helping draft really robust cybersecurity policies and procedures, assisting with or flat out conducting the annual cybersecurity assessments that I expect to be part of the final rule, certainly, and then stepping in to assist and triage in the event that an advisor does experience a substantive cybersecurity incident. And so I think that's a perfect segue to Michelle's tip here on this slide.
Yeah, and Jason, just an interesting point to bring up. In one of the slides, you had a point that talked about, focusing on the 7 pillars, in the SEC's 2020 OC cybersecurity and resilience observations, and going back and kind of thinking about that. I also think that, just kind of adding to the annual review, if you're kind of stuck with what else should I be thinking about for conducting the annual review this year, that's a great starting point. I thought that was a great point you made, to just think about that. If the proposed rule, if you're doing your annual review right now and you're thinking about what should I be looking at, I think that's a great place to start. And I also think that to that end, you also mentioned in one of the slides to work with management and IT to mitigate findings in the assessment. And I think that one of the things that, if you're thinking about the reporting aspect of it, just a risk, mitigation perspective, I would love to have in that report that I'd be, submitting to the SEC that we worked with XYZ vendor and our senior management team to identify, to mitigate. So I think, so often, or of the implementer, of the doer, of the overseer, right? It's going to be super important in these cyber events that we truly have, that senior management team aware, that the board of directors is made aware, that there's steps in place for how we're going to report and how we made the determination, not only that we're reporting to the SEC in that 48-hour window, because I think there's a lot of questions of, well, what's material? What do I need to report? What if it's just, I got a breach or I needed a patch? It's not about security patch, it's about a true cyber event. That's what we're all craving that additional guidance on. But the other question is, how do I report that to the consumer? And that, I think, becomes super interesting. So I love the fact that, that does play into how am I going to work with the cyber service provider, and also should they have a seat at the table when we're talking about some of this eradication when that cyber event occurs, which really goes into my risk management tip, which is, the need for heightened vendor due diligence. It would be really interesting, I think, to have some dialogue with either your internal folks, if you're exclusively using your own IT staff. Usually you do supplement that with, at least one outsource. At least that's what I've seen in most firms for some of the more complex IT needs. But it would be really interesting to find out not just, how they might assist you, but also what their own cybersecurity program is, okay? And thinking about it from, what is my IT vendor doing? How can I expect that communication? When does compliance need to be notified by the IT vendor? that there is a cyber event. It's not just I'm waiting for my quarterly health report card or a report. It's you really want to know what's going on, how things are being addressed. Is it a red, yellow, green flag type situation? And I think that's something you really need to have that conversation with. And, you know, to some of the points that Christian and Jason made in their slides, you know, when I'm looking at vendor due diligence, I'm going to challenge you to dust off your DDQ that you might be using now for cyber events, and also expand that to include such areas as Reg SP, Reg SID. Those are areas that the staff's concerned about. What are their identity theft controls? How are they going to notify you if there's a cyber event? And, you know, and I'll give you an example. Sometimes you have cyber events that occur that you never even learn about until they actually submit the DDQ. And they're like, well, we didn't necessarily think it didn't affect any consumer. So if it didn't affect the end consumer, we're not aware of it. We decided we didn't need to cause an alarm. I don't think that passes muster anymore. So, you know, take a look at when is your expectation for them to report cyber events to you, and see how you've communicated that to them, and are they willing to do that? Because some of the larger vendors, I know they will probably shun that away and say, we don't need to do that, too time consuming, too voluminous, what have you. You know, but at the end of the day, this is your own cybersecurity program. So you need to just be aware of what they're going to do. And for, you know, some of the folks that I've heard, I've sent DDQs to, you know, the big gorilla out there, and the big gorilla doesn't want to respond to it. I'd say, great, show your efforts, put it in your folder, and you can show that to the SEC when they come in to do the exam. We did a good faith, reasonable attempt to try to get this information. And that should go into one of your factors as to whether or not we wish to continue the use of that vendor. Christian?
Absolutely. Yeah, so my tip is, you know, make some time, right? Make some time to go through your policies, you know, understand if you have the right personnel, if you have the right budget, and, you know, for anything new that might be coming or anything that you feel you need to shore up based on these, based on the rules. So, you know, give yourself some time, make sure you have the right people in the room, like Michelle said, and give yourself some budget if you think that there's going to be some shoring up to do. And that goes into my next slide, just kind of a high level, you know, some high level thoughts on what we kind of consider a good cyber environment. You know, it's perfectly acceptable to right size your security program, right? I mean, there are small environments, there's massive environments, and the risk that you determine, you know, is going to vary widely between sides of firms. So don't feel like this program is oh so prescriptive and it is going to drastically change what you have in place today. You are going to want to look at your procedures and controls and make sure that they're, you know, meeting the needs. This is a great time to review and maybe try to level up. But it's not like this set. It has a huge amount of prescriptive controls that tell you exactly how you must do everything. They cover the main, you know, the main things you would think about: user security and access, information protection, threat vulnerability management, all of the things that we've been talking about. But you can right size it for your firm. And like Michelle said, as long as you have it documented, as long as you're doing what you say you do and it's reasonable, the SEC is going to generally be good, right? They're not coming in and saying, are you using this particular technology? Or, oh my God, why didn't you do this one thing? There is no one thing. It's about a leveled approach. It's about having good programs in place, good policies in place. So you can be creative. You can, you know, you work with your provider to understand kind of what's, you know, best practice. And it's not, you know, the investment that you have to make if you have a reasonable procedures and controls in place today is not going to be, you know, an order of magnitude higher. We feel like good security outcomes require a layered approach, right? We don't think that there's one, you know, magic bullet. There's one really expensive thing that if you just buy this one firewall, you're good, right? In kind of the disconnected world we're in, where data is in a lot of SaaS providers, it's on endpoints. We think that, you know, controlling identity is really important. Understanding that identity lifecycle from when an employee comes on, what they have access to, what apps they have access to employee exit, making sure that that access is revoked and they don't, you know, have residual access to kind of, you know, systems that aren't in kind of your core identity stack. That's really important. Obviously, protecting and monitoring that identity is really important. We feel like a single identity that is, you know, highly monitored, you know, multi-factored with strong multi-factor authentication is really important, and bodes well for a good security outcome. Securing the endpoints, right, around active threats and general compliance, being able to report on those endpoints, understand if they're meeting all of the policies and requirements that you have in place, and having good security awareness, testing and training for employees is a pillar that we really care about. So again, in this more disconnected world, right, where endpoints can be anywhere, employees can be anywhere, we feel like really looking at identity, endpoints, and kind of your employees themselves are good layers. It's a good approach, and if you're doing those things, that you're going to be in a good spot as it relates to cybersecurity. Next slide. I think this is back to you, Michelle.
No, actually, this is me. No worries. Thanks, Christian. So again, continuing with the theme of some best practices, starting at the top here, I'd say, as the Boy Scouts like to say, be prepared. At this point in time, there's really no advisor out there that shouldn't have at least done some preparation for the possibility of the SEC coming in and kicking the tires on their cybersecurity program. Now we've got the pending new cyber rule, and I think that sensitivity should be heightened even more. I mean, it's getting real. There have been sweep exams going on for a few years now that has led to a lot of the guidance that's been put out by the SEC. Last year, the cyber and crypto assets unit within enforcement was doubled in size. So clearly the SEC is gearing up to be doing a lot more as it pertains to cybersecurity. And as Michelle mentioned, it was again listed as an exam priority this year. So there should be no mystery. This is happening, and firms really need to get their ducks in a row to be prepared. If you're not already being proactive and working on getting a robust program in place, do it now. This is the year. We're in June already. The rule hasn't been finalized. We don't know of an implementation date yet, but I think everybody is of the same mind that is coming this year. So it is time to get prepared. Again, the assessments, I've mentioned it 4 times, 5 times now. I think this is huge. No matter what changes happen to the rule between now and when it goes live, this isn't going anywhere. The SEC's been talking about it for 3+ years now. I call it a must practice, not just a best practice. I mean, it'd be crazy not to start looking at figuring out how you're going to accomplish this. The 7 pillars that were on an earlier slide that Michelle re-referenced, in the context of a regular annual review, a 20647, I was looking at one for a client of ours, and my feedback was, hey, list the 7 pillars right in here, so that the client is fully aware of what we're talking about when we say that the SEC has their own ideas as to what it should look like. So it's important. That is what the cyber assessment will be based on, and it makes a heck of a lot of sense to have the cybersecurity portion of your 20647 tied directly to what the cyber assessment will be. So this is what the future is, and I'd say get on it now. And again, having a third party working hand in hand with you on the sort of technical aspects of all this is a darn good idea. On the next slide, if we could advance, please. I think education is a great way to hopefully continue what you're doing as it pertains to cybersecurity. I'd encourage you to go out and look at the resources that are available out there. There's a lot. The SEC risk alerts that have been coming out on cyber, I think since 2012 or 13. I mean, it's not new. The OC cybersecurity and resiliency observations from 2020 that we mentioned a couple of times, that's where the pillars are listed and explained. Very important resource, I think. And there's any number of white papers and articles that have been published by firms like Core Compliance, firms like Xantrion, however many, law firms have put information out there. So if you're not sure what you should be thinking about, go get on Google and you'll find a treasure trove of information. Again, we're hitting a lot of the same marks multiple times here because they're all important. The due diligence on third parties, we talked about it a lot. I won't dwell on it, but just wanted to repeat the significance of needing to focus on those third-party cybersecurity programs, as Michelle mentioned, they may not be regulated like you are as an advisor, but by default, you're having to live to those standards. So you want to be really sure that the firms that you deal with and have access to your systems and your client information and assets have things buttoned up as tightly as you do. It's an absolute must. And that's both initial and ongoing due diligence, right? It's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process that you need to be on top of. And the last couple of things I wanted to mention, expertise here. I mean, Michelle talked about having a CISO in place. If for whatever reason you're not quite there yet, but you could find somebody to be a part of your team that has some level of cybersecurity experience or even a whiff of expertise, great. You know, management team, your compliance team, your internal IT team, somebody who can speak this language would be good. It's never a bad thing to have a knowledgeable resource like this in-house. And if you have you know, if you're in a position to have a CISO, even better, obviously. And then last, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention insurance. You know, many firms that I've seen over the last 10 years or so in doing compliance consulting, they've actually have gotten out ahead of it a little bit and have some level of cybersecurity coverage in place. But now, as we're thinking about all this, now would be a good time to take another look at the coverage you have. Talk to your IT folks, talk to management. If you're using a third party, talk to them, take a look at the coverage you have in place to determine whether it's accurate. And if you don't have anything, talk to those same people and go out and figure out what is sufficient for your business and get that coverage. It's a great way to play a little CYA. And with that, I will throw it over to Ann.
Okay, I'm actually going to take this one, Jason, on, you know, as we kind of want to make sure that we have enough time for questions at the end. And as we start talking about key tips and takeaways, you know, I want you to think about it this way, okay? We're you know, on the track, we're ready to start the race, okay? Don't wait and get left behind, okay? So, you know, I think, you know, once we have final guidance on the rule, I think we can all take a look at it and consider, you know, a lot of times I get pushback on, well, it's proposed, what do I really need to do? We don't know if that's going to be the final rule. And I agree with that point. I'm not going to disagree. The however part is, within the proposed rule, there are some really good internal control guidance statements that the staff has provided. And what I'm always questioning is, as a fiduciary, should I even be thinking about this now? Why do I need to wait? So, you know, think about, you know, what is out there in the proposed rule. I'm also going to ask you to please jot this down. You know, the SEC has given so much guidance on this, and I think one of the best pages they have on their website is as it relates to cybersecurity. If you go to sec.gov, it's under securities topics, so it's securities-topic/cybersecurity. That's going to lead you to their cybersecurity page, and it really focuses on what's important to them. And you'll see that there is a Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, that we have this guidance on. There's proactive, you know, they have a CISA Shields Up guidance page that talks to you about all the different compliance controls you should be thinking about. So as you're looking at, to the next bullet point, your governance program, what do we have in place? What should we have in place? There's some great guidance on this page that's been developed for you to use as almost like a checklist. And that's what I would recommend doing. And then think about, you know, all of these things I also understand cost money. So it's getting, you know, we're at the halfway part of the year. I can't believe it's already June 1st. But think about what's in the budget for this year, what might we need to push to next year, and thinking about that this program, if this is, you know, goes live, it's not if, it's when it goes live, there will be some dollar tags attached to it. So let's not blindside senior management. Let's make sure we've got a good budget in place. Let's think about that we know what we should be thinking about in adding, you know, over here is a cyber expert to your management team. Does that person, are they currently employed? Is that somebody I need to look for? It's going to depend on the size of your organization. I also think that if it's someone internal, think about additional training that might be needed. You know, and that would then go to a budget line item. And then finally, you know, consider all the internal controls that might be needed. I love, like I said, the cybersecurity page because it talks about, you know, everything from getting information on how to get ahead of ransomware and how do we stop it, how do we do training, how should we keep a watchful eye on our cybersecurity program. You know, I think that all needs to go into play and looking at, again, the policies and procedures, what might we need to fine tune, et cetera. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through every single one of these points of view. We'll be receiving this slide deck within the next 24 hours in addition to a recording of this presentation. But I do want to focus on really the last bullet point, okay? When you're developing the reasonable, and I will stress that word, reasonable incident response program for what you'll do both the short-term and long-term outages, you know, what I'm seeing is one general plan that's being done without consideration of the short-term and the long-term game. And I think what we need to think about is, you know, sometimes an incident would occur and the feedback we've gotten is, oh, you'll be back up in 24 hours. Well, you might be up in 24 hours for critical things, but you might not be able to rebuild, for example, someone's entire system and all that data, and we've got to QC that and everything else. So you really need to think about what can we do in the short term to make sure that we're operational and functioning, able to really provide that client servicing, but also what's that longer term game? And that's what I'm not seeing in the incident response plans. That should also go into what am I thinking about of how would I report this to the SEC, and as well as documenting that in terms of the compliance program as part of my assessment. And with Ann, I'd love to give you the floor to see if we have any questions out there to make sure we have some time to address them.
Absolutely. So please go ahead and submit questions via chat. I'll give you just a second if you've been holding on to something and want to enter it now. And while we're waiting for people to enter questions, maybe, Jason, we can start off by adding additional color around something that you talked about a number of times today. And I think it's really relevant for the people who are attending. And that is, you've talked about potentially using a third party to help with an assessment. In your opinion, what are the kinds of things you should be looking for in a third party that can help companies with these kinds of activities?
Bad timing, excuse me. Yeah, I mean, quite simply, you want to look to a firm that basically plays in the space where, sorry, where the SEC is. In a past life, we spent quite a bit of time looking at different vendors that were in the ballpark of doing cybersecurity assessments. This goes back about 4 years, so we were really nowhere near the new rule. And the firm we ultimately selected was one that was a combination of IT people and securities industry people. So that was one way to skin the cat, if you will. We felt comfortable that they could handle it. They were well aware of all the risk alerts and guidance coming out of the SEC. So as I'm sure you and Christian are, that's sort of a, you know, we want somebody who's speaking that language, right? You may talk to a run-of-the-mill IT firm that says, yeah, we can do an assessment, but are they doing the right kind of assessment? Are they looking at all the right things? Do they speak the same language that advisory firms speak? If as an advisory firm, you're doing diligence on a third-party specialist like this to help with your policies and procedures or to do an assessment, those are the things to think about, right? You should be able to figure out pretty quickly if they can at least talk the talk in terms of knowing what the 7 pillars are, knowing what the SEC is, right? That's a thing. Not every IT firm has any clue. So it's like anything else here. It's a matter of good due diligence, getting yourself an understanding and a level of comfort that the firms you're speaking with know exactly what you're talking about in terms of an investment advisor needing to do a cybersecurity assessment that meets the SEC's standards and expectations.
Perfect. And we're starting to get some questions to the chat. One of the questions is it best practice to send the vendor DDQ annually as opposed to taking a one and done approach?
Yeah,
so Okay, go ahead.
We're all jumping.
No, go ahead, Christian. I'll add to your response.
Okay. I mean, maybe there'll be different opinions. I don't think all vendors are created equal. I think for some really large vendors, doing a single assessment, kind of almost to tick the box, right? Like on a big SaaS provider, taking doing one DDQ and kind of filing it away and being able to reference back to that is okay. I think for smaller vendors that may change, especially if they're improving, it makes sense to go back. So if you have a key vendor that didn't really give you an adequate adequate answers, it's probably good to make that known and then go back and do another one a year later to again hope to improve that to a better spot, just to align with your own risk. So I mean, that's mine, and Michelle can weigh in, agree, disagree.
Yeah, and I would take a slightly different approach from the standpoint of, I agree with you that not all vendors are created equal. And what I want you to think about is what are the vendors that are obtaining your confidential client information, okay? And we know that that's going to be, for example, the custodian, and it might be certain folks that you engage in for a performance reporting and the like. So you could do almost like as part of your cyber risk assessment is identifying these are the vendors that are obtaining that information. If I know that they're getting client information, I'm going out annually with that because I want to know, have they had a cyber event that's put us at risk, right? And then what is that level of communication back? I agree with you from the standpoint of if they give you a thorough response and they have their SaaS reports and what have you, not worried about it, but it's where they avoid the questions, where they don't want to respond, they don't give you anything. Now I'm actually pinging them and going back out and saying, okay, do we have an issue here? Because I need this for my books and records. And at least you're showing, again, those efforts being made in obtaining that information.
Yeah,
so
I would just add, on an ongoing basis, keep an eye on the news online about the vendors you use, right?
Great
if you
point.
see things like big lawsuits, data breaches, acquisitions, mergers, you'll want to be on top of that as circumstances warrant for these vendors. So it's not a true set it and forget it. You need to be aware of what's going on inside these businesses. And if you see things that look a little funny, send them a questionnaire. Can't hurt.
So we're coming up on time, and I want to be respectful. If you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists for a 15-minute free consultation. And in addition, in the email that we send out with this deck and the recording of this presentation, we'll make sure to include that website that Michelle referenced earlier. And with that, I'd really like to thank people for their time and attention. I hope this was useful, and we look forward to potentially seeing you again in another webinar. Thank you.